Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Sean Smoot, the Chief Legal Counsel for the Illinois Police Benevolent and Protective Association, and talk about police-community relations, whether the use of police body cameras is a good thing, and what Mr. Smoot says is the severe lack of police officers in Chicago. This runs about 40 minutes.
Sean Smoot, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Pleasure to be here, Terry. Thanks for having me.
As we sit here, there's been so much of late in the national news, most of it bad news, about the different shootings going on both in New Orleans and in Dallas. We hear any number of things going on a periodic basis in Chicago relative to police action or misaction, the Black Lives Matter movement. So we wanted to talk to you and kind of put some of this in perspective and get your insights as the head of the Police Benevolent and Protective Association. As you look at these issues, what's your reaction? What would you want people to consider as they hear this information come out?
Well, I think, perspective is important. And one of the things that we lose sight of is, yes, we are experiencing in some places, particularly in Chicago is a good example, significant increases in shootings and homicides. But, taken in a historical perspective, short-term history, the numbers are very high. But we're not setting records. So that means that numbers have been higher in the past. And
when you say the numbers are high, what numbers do you mean?
Particularly violent crime shooting numbers, which seem to be the ones that the media focuses on the most.
And you're talking about relative to police shootings?
Relative to officer-involved shootings and just relative to the real high numbers are actually shootings that occur where in a lot of cases, gang members are shooting at each other, and unfortunately, the number's fairly high as well of just innocent bystanders that get in the middle of those shootings as well. In terms of officer-involved shootings, in other words, when I say that, I'm talking about an incident where a police officer shoots somebody. Those numbers are actually down significantly nationally. Over the last year, in particular the first several months of this year, they're way down. Now, a lot of people have different opinions as to why those numbers are down as well. But the fact of the matter is, you have a city like Chicago where violent crime is up very high, shootings are up extremely high numbers compared to the last 10 years. If we go back 20 years, you would see numbers from the 1990s that were very similar to the shooting numbers that we're having today in Chicago. I think the big issue really is when we compare what's happening in Chicago in terms of overall crime numbers and what's happening in other major cities, some of which are significantly larger than Chicago, like New York and Los Angeles. Their crime numbers are far, far lower. In fact, there's been more shootings in the city of Chicago this year than there have been in New York and Los Angeles combined. And I think if you combine those two cities, you really have almost 8 or 9 times the population of Chicago.
The Laquan McDonald shooting was one of the more famous incidences of recent times and continues to percolate and have ramifications. Unfortunately, it kind of made people think how shootings like this can be swept under the rug. The prosecuting, Anita Alvarez, prosecuting attorney for Cook County, didn't release the video for a year afterwards. But let's talk about, on the other hand, there's now a movement to have cameras on police officers throughout the land. Is that something that is welcomed by the police departments? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? What's your take on it?
I think it's a double-edged sword. So in one respect, I think it's very welcome by members of the community because they believe that the presence of the camera will provide evidence of how the police conduct themselves when they're interacting with the public. I can say along the same line, they're welcomed by the police for the same reason, because they can show how the police interact with citizens and how citizens interact with the police. And so, you know, I think from both standpoints, there may be a bit of apprehension, just in terms of people thinking that officers feeling like, you know, Big Brother's watching them. At the same time, you have citizens with the same types of fears that, you know, because police are wearing cameras, that their privacy rights will be in some way reduced. And
Well, and on that, let's say if somebody gets a DUI, they're going to be recorded.
yes.
It might be the only time in their life they have a DUI. Has anyone discussed these issues about who has control of that video? Does that video just sit out there in the public domain indefinitely? Because that obviously could damage someone's career.
I think that's a great example, and actually that's one, you know, we actually passed a law here in Illinois 1 year ago, August 1st, so it's been a year and a month. It went into effect January 1st of this year regarding body-worn cameras. Now, so let's take your example. Somebody, you know, the one time in their life when they make a mistake, they get a DUI, there's some embarrassing video out there. If it's body-worn camera video, if the person, if the video doesn't get flagged for some other reason, for instance, complaints made against the officer that they mistreated the individual, or it gets flagged because it's going to be used as evidence in a criminal case, then under our law, under the current law, 90 days after that recording was made, it'll be destroyed. And so that was actually one of the concerns that the ACLU and some other groups involved in drafting the bill voiced very loudly, was that, you know, that we would be creating this type of video that you're talking about that will be around forever. Some states, like the state of Washington, have extremely liberal public information disclosure laws. And so you have police departments like the city of Seattle, which has virtually posted every body-worn camera video that the department has on a YouTube channel. Now, what they did, and which is permissible under their laws, they posted the video, but they've blurred everyone's face. So it's there for anyone in the public to see, but you can't really see who they are.
I know there's these scam businesses down in Florida that will take people's mug shots and put them up on a website, and you know, especially going back to the DUI example,
Right.
You know, people have to pay $300 to get these people to take it down.
Get
It's
off.
really blackmail.
Right.
I mean, they operate technically legally, but it's a concern, and so the public ought to be aware that when we're talking about this, I think they think, well, that's not going to involve me. That's like they envision the South Side of Chicago, some police officer with some gangbanger.
Right.
It may very well affect you or your children
Absolutely.
or something else.
Absolutely. I mean, and so, you know, the goal of the law and the goal of having these cameras is not to create, you know, gotchas for people, members of the public, or for police officers either. You know, and in, you know, over 90% of the cases where external complaints are made and a department has put a body-worn camera program in place, the camera footage actually exonerates the officer.
You know, it's interesting. I just heard this morning a bit of an interview that somebody did. They were talking about this new book, Chicago is Not Broke. And the point of the book, as I understand it, is that there's all kinds of money the city is spending that it needn't spend. And one of those is they were saying over the last 10 years or so, the city has spent, I don't want to get it too high, but like $50 million settling police cases.
Yes. A year.
A year.
Yeah. That's true.
So, which is an enormous sum. On one hand, having some of these cameras would probably pay for themselves if somebody's making an accusation.
Yes.
That is not going to be borne out, to show that the police officer was professional. On the other hand, we have in most cases, I guess, unionized police forces, and certainly in the larger cities. Would this help to get rid of some of those officers who are acting in a way that is not professional?
Well, I think, look, first of all, we have to start from a premise here, and that premise is there are people in every profession that shouldn't be there. I don't care if it's doctors, lawyers, bankers, even politicians now and then wind up in places
Or journalists.
they shouldn't be, or journalists. And so, certainly, the cameras are going to capture events that occur. And if somebody makes a mistake, that's going to be captured. If somebody has a habitual use of force abuse problem, that's going to be captured, certainly. But I think if you ask police officers, by and large, the answer that you're going to get in terms of, do we really want to protect any of these people? The answer is always no. A good police officer's worst enemy is a bad police officer. Because, and I think we see this virtually every day, and I'm fortunate because I get exposed to the really good things that police do. And, and the problem is, for every 10,000 great things that police officers do every day, it only takes one bad thing for one police officer to do, and that'll be what leads to headlines for the next 2 months.
Well, and to that end, we've also seen video recently, not to spend the whole time here on video, but we've also seen video where officers are pulling people out of car wrecks that might be on fire and being heroic.
Absolutely.
So.
And comforting babies. There was just an amazing phenomenon on Facebook where a female officer, I think from North Carolina, responded to a scene where two parents had overdosed, and one of them died as a result of the overdose. The other parent was I think is in the hospital and recovering. There were 3 children there, and there's someone took a picture of this woman officer comforting this baby, and the baby asleep on her shoulder, and that within 2 hours on Facebook, that had, I don't know how many thousand hits. I mean, it's still circulating around. I think we've got it on our Facebook page. It's so but that's and the line, the interview of the officer was, basically she said, "Hey, we do this every day."
I was going to say that the new reality, and I sometimes think that all of us are still not yet intellectually embracing this, is that increasingly we're going to be on a televised world, and with platforms such as Facebook, we're all going to have a little more exposure, and so we all have to kind of adjust to that new reality. We almost, when there's something happening these days and no one has video of it, it's almost shocking that there wasn't some camera somewhere to capture some of it.
And I think that's an important point too, and that's one of the things, we never kind of made the full circle on the issue of, do police departments are they welcoming the body camera technology? One of the concerns that I've heard is regarding this stuff is, there was a certain, and if you talk to prosecutors, you'll hear them talk about the CIS phenomenon. And what that refers to is there's a myriad of shows, NCIS and NCIS Miami and I don't know, there was 3 or 4 others, where the television program really kind of focused on the forensic abilities of these crack law enforcement agencies, so that they maybe the opening scene would be a murder, and then within 30 minutes they'd have DNA, and they'd have all these all this physical evidence collected of leading to who committed the crime. Really entertaining shows, but really entertainment, because it bears absolutely no reflection of the reality that law enforcement finds itself in today in terms of forensic evidence collection and processing. I don't know how many DNA kits we still have at the Illinois State Crime Lab awaiting processing. I mean, going back years and years. So this idea that you can get these results at the snap of a finger really put into people's mind. And what happened, so when prosecutors talk about the CIS phenomenon, what they're talking about is it's very difficult to get juries to convict in many cases because they're expecting there to be evidence there that they've seen produced on these television shows, which isn't there. Similarly now, I think, and more, this is going to your point, it's going to get more and more prevalent. If there's not officer provided video, either from a body-worn source or from a dashboard source, there really will be a presumption in people's minds that there's a reason it wasn't there.
Well, we had a case of that recently where all of a sudden there was like 3 or 4 officers there and no one's camera was working, and so the presumption was that you guys turned it off to engage in malfeasance, you know.
Right. And so, you know, I think I know the case that you're talking about, and so I suspect that the facts will bear out that that it wasn't the case. But the interesting thing about the technology is that when people expect it to be there and it's not there, you know, that they form an opinion in their mind that, you know, maybe the person's credibility, in this case the law enforcement officer's credibility, is suspect.
Let me ask, again, because I didn't want to spend the whole time talking about video, but that's one of the, tell us just for a moment, I probably should have started here, about your organization. Who do you represent and where are your members?
We represent police officers all over the state, from as far south as I would venture Maryville, Glen Carbon, the Metro East area, Alton, several places down there, up to Chicago and Waukegan, and over to Joe Davies County.
Now, is there a difference between police officers and like sheriff, or are you covering anyone in law enforcement?
Law enforcement officers, so peace officers, which would include sheriff's deputies. We represent probably 10,000 active and retired officers all over the state of Illinois. Our smallest department, you know, maybe a Metro East area department that has, you know, 15 or 20 officers. Our largest group is the Chicago Sergeants Association, which has 1,250.
And so you would represent them. Well, you do a variety of things, which, I mean, on one hand, as you alluded to, you're going to help get a bill passed. You might help you do some lobbying, let's say. So you're going to either try to get a bill stopped that you think is a bad bill, or get a bill passed you think is going to be an improvement. But by the same token, you also served on President Obama's Council of 21st Century Policing,
Yes.
where there is a collection of people looking down the road of what do we need to change, what's working, what's not working. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that came from that effort that you think is going to improve policing nationwide over the next decade or so?
I think it really provides a roadmap for, and what you're referring to is the President's Task Force report, Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And I think it really provides a roadmap for police departments to kind of come into the 21st century. If you go through the report itself, you know, you'll see identification of virtually every serious issue that's facing law enforcement today, and then a set of recommendations and action items to implement those recommendations.
Can you tell us first, what are some of them?
Sure. So, you know, I think probably one of the most important pillars in the report is the first one, which is trust and legitimacy, and how important it is to build trustful relationships between law enforcement officers and the communities that they serve. And you know, we tend to over-focus on statistics a lot in policing, and what I mean by that is there was a system for police management called CompStat that was developed in New York City probably 15 to 20 years ago. And the idea behind CompStat was to hold police supervisors for certain geographic areas, or defined geographic areas, responsible for upticks in crime within their geographic area of supervision. And what that really resulted in was a lot of data compilation for the New York City Police Department. They were very successful in reducing crime and in recognizing patterns of increases in certain crimes and then deploying resources to solve those problems. I think the big challenge that was created as a result of CompStat, though, was there became almost an overemphasis on, for patrol officers, the line officers, to really focus on the number of stops that they made, the number of frisks that they made, the
So it
number
became
of
a
arrests that they
paperwork
made.
nightmare for the patrol officer?
Well, not only that, Terry, but it also, it wasn't just a paperwork issue. It was an issue about, here's the thing, no matter if it's police or other employees, when you're counting things, the interpretation that your employees get is what you count is what's important. And so rather than emphasizing the relationship between officers and citizens, a lot of departments got into a modality where they became very focused on certain crime stats: homicide, burglaries, violent crimes, and the thought was the more aggressive officers were on smaller crimes, and the more aggressive officers were in interacting with people, doing stop and frisk, trying to find firearms on people, drugs, and so forth, that would reduce those numbers, the serious crime numbers. Didn't really bear out that way, and really built a chasm between the communities that need police the most and the officers that police in those communities. And so, during the task force hearings, we heard hundreds of witnesses, and I should say probably 100, maybe 120 to 150 live witnesses, and then we took tens of thousands of pages of written testimony that was submitted. And so, when you have a young African...
Can I interject for a moment? This sounds a little bit like Rudy Giuliani when he became mayor, that they started this program of tackling the minor crimes like graffiti and things like that, which cleaned up an area, and it kind of destroyed the environment in which crime thrived, if I understand what their point would be. But they also had the stop and frisk, which now I think has been discontinued. But what I hear them talking about is that then crime has come back up because you're not doing the stop and frisk. Is there any solid consensus of whether that was a good thing as far as a law enforcement tool or not?
So it probably depends on what your philosophy of policing is. In many respects, they got more guns off the street. Was crime reduced? Certainly the stats were reduced. And we can get into that. I think you and I have both been around long enough to know that statistics are easily manipulated, depending on what you want them to show. Unfortunately, what we saw as a result of CompStat was a significant amount of pressure put on police supervisors that was then pushed down to frontline supervisors, who then pushed it down to the line officers to do things like reclassify crimes so that they would be classified as less serious than maybe what they really were. So instead of an attempted rape, you might have an attempted burglary or an attempted break-in reported. And there was a pretty significant scandal involving this, somebody actually recording briefings that took place in the New York City Police Department. These were reported
where they were being instructed to diminish the reporting.
They were basically being told, hey, the watch commander doesn't want to get chewed out at the CompStat meeting next week. If you have any breaking and enterings, report them as whatever the next lower crime you can report them as, so that essentially the message that went out, which I think Chicago Magazine did a three-part story about 2 years ago. It was a very similar situation occurred in Chicago where detectives were told to report things that were obviously homicides as, mysterious deaths or attempted suicides to make the numbers look better. At least that was the implication in the article. And so, it has a terrible effect within, especially a police organization, for officers to be given the message that, it's okay to be dishonest about something if it makes you look good. And I think that really has a,
Kind of is a cancer within the department.
it just wears at that trust foundation that they should have. So,
We don't have time to go through all of these. These are all interesting. I wish.
I'll come back.
It'd be good, yeah, to follow up. It would be good, And let's take relationships. I've wondered, and I've never lived in Chicago, but when we know the preponderance of crime is going to be in certain areas, do you find when you look at the distribution of police officers, are they being assigned where they should be assigned? In other words, can we go, or do we need more police officers assigned to these heavy crime areas? Is that an issue when you talk with other departments? I mean, just how strategically crime is being handled?
Well, I think Chicago's, first of all, obviously it's the biggest city in our state, so, and it's the biggest city in the Midwest.
So it certainly represents a special challenge,
but,
you might say, compared to
yeah,
smaller
exactly.
towns.
That's exactly my point. Now, I will say this. I spend a lot of time in Chicago. Some of my biggest units of folks, police officers that I represent, work in and around Chicago. Chicago is grossly understaffed.
In terms of police officers?
In terms of police officers everywhere, in every neighborhood.
Why is that? Because the city is having such financial difficulties?
I think the city has made a judgment a few years ago that it would be more cost effective for them to allow the ranks to kind of dwindle, to push officers off of desk assignments and put them out on the streets as folks retired, but not actually replace street officers. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that.
Do you know what the numbers are like today compared to, are they down by 5,000 officers, or what's the number?
No, I mean 5,000 would be a huge amount. But I do think they're down, I think they're down about 1,500 from where they should be. And I suspect, they're under a Department of Justice investigation. I suspect the DOJ will find that there's not enough officers and not enough supervisors as part of their investigation. That's strictly my opinion, but I'll be very surprised if that isn't noted, at least noted in their investigation report. And so, there's a shortage of officers in most departments, but in Chicago, it's
more pronounced.
It's very, very pronounced.
When we talk about going into Chicago, and we might say, okay, we're not going to stop and frisk. We're not going to go out of our way. I guess the argument would be to cause confrontational relationships. But what can be done when we have an area like the South Side or West Side of Chicago with heavy crime areas, and there's an environment there that's just going to be different in, let's say, more law-abiding areas? Are we asking too much to say police officers can address this through community relations, or is, that would seem to me to be asking the impossible of the officers? They might try to work and not be seen as the bad guy on the street, but to be more the police officer is your friend, which is how, when I was growing up, I viewed police officers.
Right.
But they're still going to be working in these areas where there's an environment of people engaging in criminal activity that is more considered a norm than it would be in law-abiding areas.
Well, I think that's, I don't want to necessarily categorize anyone as, that their situation is, or that the norms of that community are that criminal activity is okay. I will say this. I think everybody recognizes, at least anybody who really thinks about these issues recognizes that we can't expect the police to solve all the problems in these communities. If you look at an area like Englewood, where there's a tremendous amount of violence virtually every day, and if you look at what else is in that community, you're going to see an island there. There is very little access to health care, very little access to or no access to jobs in the community, no access to good groceries for that matter, and challenged schools. So you have all of these other pressures on that community. Now, we could put a police officer on every corner. That's not going to solve all these other underlying issues and the fact that there's no economic development in that neighborhood. And so I do think that that's an unrealistic expectation. However, I also think it's important that we look at what success has been achieved in other places like Los Angeles, where because of a significant investment by the city of Los Angeles, they have turned around the relationship between police and the community in places like Watts, where has been a historically.
In '65, it was a horrible riot.
And again in the early '90s. And so if you look at the work that they've done there, and it's not easy, and it takes
When you
resources.
say they made an investment, in terms of what? Did they do something for economic redevelopment in the area? Did they add more police officers to the area?
Well, they added a number of things. First of all, they made a real investment in terms of policing. And when I say policing, I'm not necessarily emphasizing the enforcement in law enforcement. They, in the city of Los Angeles, they created a unit that was dedicated. It's a 3-year commitment, minimum 3-year commitment for officers who get assigned to this unit, and their job is to essentially work in the community to help identify problems in the communities and help develop solutions, and act as ambassadors for the city, ambassadors for the police department. I think there's, in Watts now, I think there's about 45 to 50 of these officers. And they're involved in, not just patrolling, but, having community meetings. They know everyone in the neighborhood. They made a commitment to being involved in things like after-school programs for the youth. They have football leagues for the youth, baseball leagues, and police officers who act as coaches and mentors in various activities in these communities. And the turnabout has been very profound. You have people who would have told their children never to talk to the police, don't ever trust the police, who are now entrusting the police with their kids for prolonged periods of time. And that doesn't mean it's perfect, because it's not. Nothing's perfect. They still have shootings in Watts. They still have crime in Watts, although nothing close to what it used to be. And they have a relationship with the police so that they can help resolve issues instead of creating bigger and worse issues between officers and citizens. But it took the city of Los Angeles, remember, was under consent decree for about 15 years. They've had to make a serious financial commitment to put officers in this situation and get the officers to make a serious commitment to spend a significant portion of time in the specialty unit in Watts. And that's just one example. There are others all around the country.
I was going to say, I'd almost make an analogy. Sometimes when people are living under stress, and we see this with family disturbances, and they act in a way that they otherwise would not act. Mm-hmm. And you can see that at any number of social, it's across the spectrum of socioeconomic activity, right? I mean, family. By the same token, we might have, as in Watts, it seems to me like when you go in there and do the things that those officers are doing, you can perhaps reduce the stress level on the people living within that community so that they too then act in a more civilized way to each other, just because everyone's kind of chilling out and relaxing a little bit more and understanding that they're going to be protected and get through. It's an interesting point as far as the policing techniques do not just involve putting someone up against a wall and frisking them.
Right, and that's exactly my point. You know, the other thing is if you look at the success stories, and there are many out there, where police departments have really made the investment, great things can happen in those communities. And if you look at neighborhoods in the city of New York, for instance, and look at what Harlem was not that long ago, maybe
Right.
15, 17 years ago.
Harlem for years was considered just a high crime area, a bad area.
Right.
No one wanted to go there, and now it's been totally.
You can't touch a
real estate prices
place
have
there
shot
for
up,
less
the
than $1
crime
million.
has dropped. Yeah.
That's right, and it's a
It's
very
been a
desirable
real
place to
success
live.
story of the last 10 years or 12 years or so.
Yeah, and so I think that's that's another example of where all the pieces kind of work together, and the neighborhood in Harlem in particular is a great example of the importance of integrating and gentrifying neighborhoods, because that's what happened there. And I don't see a lot of that in Englewood, and that's unfortunate, because I think in that neighborhood in particular, in that community, it's almost like people have given up or written off that community, and that's not what policing's about.
With Sean Smoot, maybe that's it. There's so much more we could talk about, but we appreciate the time. We'll let you get back to work.
My pleasure.
And thank you for visiting.
You bet.